Picture a town where everybody knows your name. The coffee shop where the same waitress has poured the same man's coffee for 15 years. The church where he sits third pew from the front every single Sunday. The hardware store where he waves at the owner by first name. The little league field where he cheers from the bleachers. He is woven into the fabric of this place like thread in a quilt. He belongs here. He is one of them. And that is exactly why the bodies kept piling up. Welcome to the most uncomfortable story in true crime. Not because of the killer, but because of the town. Because this isn't just a story about a monster. It's a story about every single person who looked the other way, changed the subject, or decided that protecting their neighbor was worth more than protecting his victims. It's a story told from the only vantage point that actually matters: the victims themselves. The people who were failed, not once, but twice. First by the man who took their lives, and then by an entire community that decided their lives weren't worth the conversation. So buckle in. We're going victim by victim, beat by beat, through the anatomy of a town that chose silence, and we are going to call out every failure along the way. But first, let's talk about how this is even possible. How does a serial killer operate inside a small town for 2 decades without getting caught? The answer isn't glamorous. It isn't some criminal mastermind running circles around the FBI. It's something far more mundane and far more terrifying: ordinariness. Too often, the serial murderer does not stand out. Otherwise, he would get caught. That's not a theory. That's a documented pattern. To their co-workers, neighbors, and others who knew them, they led unremarkable lives. They had careers as military pilots, police officers, landscapers, small business owners, and farmers, while they simultaneously stalked suburbs, campuses, and trailer parks. The monster doesn't look like a monster. He looks like your neighbor. He looks like the guy at the barbecue. He looks familiar, and familiarity is the most powerful armor there is. And small towns are familiarity factories. That's not a knock on small towns. It's just the social mechanics of a place where everyone knows everyone. And when everyone knows everyone, the instinct to protect your own kicks in hard. In a case like this, where pretty much everybody knew the killer, it's not only the killer being exposed, it's also everybody who knew something and didn't say anything. That's the dirty little secret of the small-town serial killer. When he finally gets caught, the town doesn't just lose the illusion of safety. It loses the illusion of its own innocence. Now, let's get to the people this video is actually about. The first person we need to talk about is the one who saw something and said nothing. Picture her clearly. She is a woman in her 40s, a fixture in this town. She has known the killer for years. Maybe they went to the same school. Maybe their kids played together. Maybe she has sat across from him at enough potluck dinners to know how he takes his potato salad. One evening, she notices something that doesn't sit right. A car parked somewhere it shouldn't be. A woman she doesn't recognize, looking frightened. The killer nearby, too calm, too controlled. She feels the pull of instinct. Something is wrong. And then the other pull kicks in. That's just him. He wouldn't. Not him. I've known him for 20 years. And she looks away. She goes home. She makes dinner. She tells herself she imagined it. She didn't imagine it. This is victim number 1 of the town itself. Not the woman in the car, though she is a victim too, and we'll get to her. But this woman, the witness who turned away, she becomes a different kind of victim. She becomes complicit in a silence she never signed up for, and she will carry that weight long after the truth comes out. Because the code of silence in a tight-knit community isn't always conscious. It isn't always cowardice. A code of silence is a condition in effect when a person opts to withhold vital information, voluntarily or involuntarily, usually followed because of threat of force, danger to oneself, or being branded a traitor or outcast. In a small town, you don't need a mafia to enforce omerta. You just need the fear of being the person who tore the community apart. And that fear is real, and it is powerful, and it is exactly what a killer counts on. Now let's talk about the first victim whose name deserved to be on the front page and wasn't. Imagine a young woman, early 20s, new to town, working a job that keeps her on the margins. Maybe she cleans rooms at the motel on the edge of the highway. Maybe she waitresses the late shift. She is not from here, which in a small town means she is always slightly outside the circle. She doesn't have the decades of social capital that make people rally around you. When she disappears, the response is not alarm. The response is a shrug, dressed up as concern. She probably just moved on. She was always a little unstable. Honestly, I'm not surprised. The police file a report. It sits in a drawer. No one pushes. No one demands answers. No one puts her face on a flyer. The majority of serial killer victims are overlooked, underreported, and rarely have families with enough resources to get attention for their case. That's not an accident. Killers know this. They calculate it. For many years, Samuel Little believed he would not be caught because he thought no one was accounting for his victims. Read that again. He knew. He knew which lives the system would fight for and which ones it would let go quietly, and he acted accordingly. Our fictional killer in our fictional town knew the same thing. He didn't pick victims randomly. He picked people the town would find easy to forget. That is not a character flaw in the victim. That is a predatory strategy, one the community's own social hierarchies made possible. And here's where the system earns its own chapter of blame. The homicide clearance rate in the United States, the metric used by the FBI to assess how many killings are solved, was nearly 58% in 2023. Nearly half of all murders in this country go unsolved. Let that sink in. Over 352,000 cases of homicide and non-negligent manslaughter went unsolved from 1965 to 2024, according to FBI data studied by the Murder Accountability Project. 352,000 people. 352,000 families sitting with open wounds and no answers. And it isn't evenly distributed. A CBS News analysis of FBI data found that murders of white victims were about 30% more likely to be solved than in cases with Hispanic victims, and about 50% more than when the victims were black. The system doesn't just fail, it fails in patterns. Predictable, documented, devastating patterns. And a small-town killer with 20 years of practice knows those patterns by heart. So our second victim, the young woman on the margins, gets a case number. She gets a file. And then she gets forgotten by the very institution that was supposed to fight for her. And the killer? He watches the calendar turn. He goes back to the coffee shop. He waves at the hardware store owner. He sits in the third pew. Now here's where I want to stop and ask you something, because this next beat is the one that haunts me most. We've established that the system failed to investigate and that the community chose silence. But what about the people who did try to speak up? The ones who brought concerns forward and were told, effectively, to sit down. Imagine a man, a neighbor, a decent man who noticed things. He went to someone in a position of authority in this town. Not the police, maybe. Maybe he didn't trust the police. Or maybe the police were part of the social fabric that insulated the killer. He went to someone, a community leader, a pastor, a local official, and he was told, gently but firmly, that he was mistaken. That this was not that kind of town. That the man he was describing was a good man, a known man, a trusted man. And just like that, the complaint evaporated. Not suppressed dramatically. just quietly dissolved in the warm water of social trust. Was the man who turned him away a monster? Probably not. Was he a coward? Maybe. Was he protecting the community's image at the expense of the community's safety? Absolutely. And that makes him the system's local representative, the human face of institutional failure. Speaking of which, here's a question worth sitting with for a second. If you were that neighbor, and you had a gut feeling that something was deeply wrong, but no hard evidence, and you knew that speaking up would make you the town pariah, what would you do? Comment your answer below. I genuinely want to know, because the answer says a lot about how these things keep happening. Now let's talk about the victim who almost got away. Every case like this has one. The person who survived an encounter, who reported it, who told the truth about what happened, and wasn't believed, or not believed urgently enough. Picture a woman who came forward and said, clearly and plainly, "This man hurt me." She gave a description. She gave details. Maybe she even gave a name. And the response she got was not a siren and an arrest. The response she got was skepticism. Questions about her credibility. Questions about her choices. Quiet suggestions that maybe she was confused, or maybe she had a history, or maybe she had reasons to exaggerate. The victims of serial killers tend to mirror the wider cultural categories of denigration characteristic of contemporary society. All societies have their own distinctive structures of symbolic denigration, whereby certain classes of people are positioned as outcasts or lesser humans, and such individuals are also disproportionately the targets of serial killers, who tend to prey upon vagrants, the homeless, sex workers, migrant workers, and the marginalized. In other words, the killer chose people the system was already primed to doubt. And when those people reported, the system did exactly what he predicted it would do. It doubted them. She was telling the truth. She was always telling the truth. And because no one moved fast enough, the killer had time to take the next one. This is where community silence and institutional failure stop being two separate problems and start being one machine with two gears. The town's silence gave the killer cover. The system's bias gave him time. Together, they ran for 2 decades without a single jam. Now let's talk about the victim, who was closest to the truth and the tragedy of proximity. There is always, in these cases, someone who was close enough to the killer to see the cracks. A family member, a long-term acquaintance, someone who noticed the mood swings, the unexplained absences, the behavior that didn't quite add up. And this person is in an impossible position that true crime rarely gives enough credit to, because knowing someone intimately doesn't make it easier to believe the worst about them. It makes it harder. After one such killer's arrest, a neighbor told CBS News, "We've been here for about 30 years, and the guy's been quiet, never really bothers anybody. We were kind of shocked." Yet another neighbor said he wasn't surprised at all because of all the creepiness. That split reaction, shock on one side, grim recognition on the other, is the exact geography of a town that chose not to have a conversation it needed to have. The person who was close to the killer carries a particular grief, because once the truth comes out, they spend the rest of their life running the tape backward, asking where the line was. When did normal become something else? When did they look away at the wrong moment? And the cruelest part is that they may never find a clean answer, because the killer was careful. He was always careful. The ordinariness wasn't an accident, it was the method. And then there is the victim who came after all of this, the one who should never have existed. Because by this point in the timeline, there were enough loose threads that a serious investigation should have begun. There were missing persons reports. There were complaints that went nowhere. There were neighbors who felt uneasy but stayed quiet. There were institutional red flags that were filed and forgotten. Every unsolved murder becomes a cold case, and the backlog is enormous. The Murder Accountability Project estimates that there are more than 250,000 unsolved murders in the United States since the year 2000 alone. 250,000. Each one of those is a person. Each one of those is a family. And in our small town, each unsolved case was a runway that gave the killer another year, another 2 years, another decade of operating in plain sight. Most cold case units are severely understaffed. A typical cold case squad might have 3 to 5 detectives responsible for thousands of cases. They can realistically review only a handful per year, prioritizing cases where new evidence emerges or forensic technology offers a breakthrough. So the victims in our town weren't just failed by community silence. They were failed by a structural reality in which their cases were mathematically unlikely to get the attention they deserved. The system wasn't evil. It was overwhelmed. And overwhelmed systems make triage decisions. And the people at the bottom of the social ladder are always the first ones triaged out. The late victim, the one who came after all the warnings, is the one that keeps investigators up at night. Because she represents the cost of delay. She represents what happens when a community's discomfort with confrontation is prioritized over a vulnerable person's right to safety. She is the answer to the question, what does silence actually cost? And the answer is everything. It costs everything. Now let's get to the reckoning, because eventually, in these stories, if there is any justice at all, the truth comes out. And when it does, the town faces something it has been avoiding for 20 years. A mirror. As one columnist wrote about a case remarkably similar to this one, a serial killer apparently works best in a silent city, or a silent town. The silence isn't just passive, it is active infrastructure for murder. Every unanswered question, every suppressed complaint, every social pressure that kept someone from speaking up, those were the bricks in the wall the killer hid behind. And when that wall comes down, the question isn't just, who did this? The question is, who let this continue? And here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, because the people who stayed silent weren't all bad actors. Most of them were ordinary people caught in the machinery of social conformity. They had mortgages and kids and reputations, and they didn't want to be the person who blew up the town over a feeling. They told themselves stories, that they were probably wrong, that someone else would handle it, that it wasn't their place. As one former police chief who worked on a similar case put it, one of the unfortunate realities of policing is that departments under pressure to solve a variety of murders may pay less attention to victims from a more vulnerable population if they don't have the same organized community pressure to solve those crimes. Read that carefully. Organized community pressure. The community has power. The community has always had power. And in our town, that power was never organized in the direction of the victims. It was organized in the direction of protecting the image of the place, protecting the comfortable fiction that this was a good town, a safe town, a town where things like this didn't happen. But things like this were happening. They were happening to real people with real names and real families. People who deserved flowers at their door, not silence at their grave. Now we get to the final victim, the one the story almost forgot. The community itself. Because here's the thing about a town that shelters a killer for 20 years. It doesn't emerge from that experience intact. The revelation doesn't cleanse, it corrodes. Neighbor looks at neighbor differently. Trust, which was the whole social currency of the place, is suddenly worthless. Every person who stayed quiet has to live with what that silence cost. Every person who spoke up and was dismissed has to live with the knowledge that they were right, and no one listened. When the truth finally breaks, the townspeople are trapped with the certain knowledge that one of them was a killer. everyone becomes a suspect, as neighbor turns against neighbor in an atmosphere of rapidly growing suspicion. The community that closed ranks to protect its own ends up destroying the very thing it was trying to protect. The irony is brutal, and it is earned. And the victims, the real victims, the ones who lost their lives, they become the center of a story they were excluded from while it was happening. Their names, finally, get said out loud. Their faces get shown. People who never knew them suddenly feel grief for them. And that grief is real, and it matters. But it comes 20 years late. It comes after a system and a community decided, repeatedly, that these particular lives were not worth the disruption of the peace. The fact that dozens of victims of assault and murder were largely ignored by authorities underscores how institutions treat crime victims differently. As criminologist Scott Bond put it, if these women had been wealthy, white, female socialites, this would have been the biggest story in the history of the United States. The invisibility of victims is not random. It follows the exact same fault lines as every other inequality in the society. The people who are most vulnerable to being killed are also the most vulnerable to being forgotten. That's not a coincidence. That's a system working exactly as its worst impulses designed it to work. So what do we do with all of this? We start by refusing to let these people be invisible. We say their names, or, in this story, we hold space for the names we don't yet know. The Jane Does, the missing persons reports that sat in drawers, the cases that never made the local paper. Across the nation, police have spent years using information from killers' confessions to reopen cold case investigations and attempt to bring closure to families who waited decades to learn what happened to the mother who vanished, the sister whose suspicious death was never explained. That work matters. That work is the opposite of what the town in this story did. It is the active, deliberate refusal to let silence win. We also start by being honest about what small-town silence actually is. It is not loyalty. It is not community spirit. When it protects a killer, it is complicity, not the dramatic, mustache-twirling kind, but the quiet, devastating, everyday kind that adds up to decades of murder going unaddressed. The code of silence only works if everyone keeps paying into it. And the moment one person decides the cost is too high, the moment one person says, "I don't care what it does to my reputation, I am going to tell the truth," the whole structure starts to crack. That person is always the most important person in the story, not the detective, not the prosecutor. The person who decided that a human life was worth more than their social standing. Every unsolved murder represents not just a failed investigation, but a failure of the social contract. Read that again, slowly. The social contract. The implicit agreement we all make to look out for each other, to treat each other's lives as valuable, to refuse to let the vulnerable be sacrificed for the comfortable. When a town shelters a killer, it isn't just breaking a law. It is tearing that contract apart, stitch by stitch, victim by victim, year by year. The people in this story, the ones who were killed, the ones who tried to report it, the ones who were doubted and dismissed and forgotten, they deserved better. They deserved a community that believed them. They deserved a system that fought for them. They deserved to be visible while they were alive, not only eulogized after they were gone. And the lesson, if there is one clean lesson to pull from 20 years of horror, is this: silence is never neutral. In a town where a killer is operating, silence is a choice. It is a vote. It is a resource that the killer draws on every single day. And every single day that the community stays quiet is a day that the next victim's clock is running down. So the next time you feel that pull, the instinct to stay quiet, because speaking up is uncomfortable, because it will cause conflict, because you might be wrong, because you don't want to be the one who tears things apart. Remember the people in this story. Remember that the town didn't tear itself apart when the truth came out. It tore itself apart in the 20 years before, one silence at a time. These people were real. Their lives were taken twice. And the least we can do, the very least, is make sure their story is told loudly enough that no other town gets to make the same choice. If this story hit you the way it hit me, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment with the name of a case you think deserves this same spotlight: the forgotten victims, the cold cases, the stories that never made the front page. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because we are not done pulling these stories out of the silence. Not even close.